The morning air was crisp, filled with the chatter of kids running toward the school entrance, backpacks bouncing against their small frames. Parents stood in clusters, sipping coffee from travel mugs, exchanging polite nods and half-hearted smiles as they rushed through their morning routines. It was the same routine every day, except today. Something was different. I felt it before I even saw them. That gnawing sensation, that tightening in my gut that told me I was walking straight into enemy territory. Heather was already there, leaning casually against Brian's luxury SUV, her arms folded, a smug smile plastered across her perfectly made-up face. Her blonde hair was curled in soft waves, her designer coat cinched at the waist like she was modeling for some high-end magazine. And beside her, Brian, tall, sharp suit, polished shoes, his whole demeanor radiating that unbearable corporate arrogance. They were waiting for me. Not by accident. Not out of coincidence. This was intentional. Every morning was the same game. Every single morning since our divorce 2 years ago, Heather made sure she was positioned in my line of sight, standing with Brian like they were royalty overseeing their kingdom. Watching. Waiting. Smirking. She wanted to see me struggle. She wanted to see me broken. But today, she was about to choke on that smirk. I stepped out of my truck, closing the door with a quiet finality, letting my presence settle before making a move. My daughter, Emma, 8 years old and full of life, reached for my hand like she always did, and I squeezed it gently. She had no idea about the battlefield we were walking onto. She just knew it was another school drop-off. Another normal morning. Heather's eyes locked onto me the second I moved. The anticipation in her expression was unmistakable. She lived for these moments, for the chance to flash her perfect, curated life in my direction like some victory parade. But her expression changed, just a flicker, just for a second, when the passenger door of my truck opened. And Ashley stepped out. Tall, graceful, radiant. Heather's face stiffened. Brian's jaw twitched. Ashley moved effortlessly, her confidence so natural it was almost unfair. She wasn't just beautiful, she was the kind of woman people noticed without meaning to. The kind that lit up a room without trying. And Heather knew it. She recognized it instantly, like a predator recognizing another force it couldn't control. Ashley walked around the truck with an easy smile, her deep brown hair catching the morning sunlight, her heels clicking against the pavement with quiet authority. She didn't even look at Heather at first, she was too focused on Emma, ruffling her hair, making her giggle before taking my other hand. That was the moment it hit Heather. The realization. The understanding. This wasn't just some rebound fling. This wasn't a one-night mistake. This was my wife. And Heather, who had spent the last 2 years painting me as the lonely, pitiful ex, the man who would never move on, had just been blindsided. Her smirk was gone. Her body stiffened. And I saw it, the exact second her world cracked. Heather's fingers twitched against the sleeve of her coat, a barely perceptible movement, but I caught it. A crack in the armor. A moment of weakness. Brian, always so sure of himself, straightened his tie and threw a quick glance at her, as if searching for a signal. Ashley, completely unbothered, leaned in close and whispered something to Emma, making her giggle again. The sound sliced through the tension like a blade. It was the kind of laughter Heather used to control, used to dictate. But not anymore. I could see the calculations happening behind her cold, green eyes. The desperate scrambling for control. She had spent 2 years crafting a narrative. That I was alone, that I was broken without her, that I would always be a shadow cast by her brilliance. And now, standing before her, was the proof that she had been dead wrong. She didn't speak first. She never spoke first. That would mean giving up power. So instead, she did what she did best. She played the role. "Oh wow," she finally said, forcing out a laugh as if the sight of me standing there with Ashley was some kind of joke. "I didn't realize you were bringing company today." Company. Like Ashley was some kind of casual +1 to my life. Ashley smiled, completely unfazed. "Oh, I'm not company. I'm his wife." The words hit like a gunshot. Brian inhaled sharply through his nose, barely masking his reaction. "Heather?" She froze for half a second, her lips parting before she caught herself. She recovered quickly, but I had seen it, the tiny fracture in her facade. Then, in true Heather fashion, she shifted gears. The mask slipped back into place, and she let out another forced laugh. "Oh, that's new." She turned her gaze toward me, her expression carefully crafted into something between amusement and condescension. "I thought you were taking things slow." "Guess not." I shrugged. "When you meet the right person, there's no reason to wait." Ashley squeezed my hand, her grip warm and steady. Heather saw it, felt it. The way we stood there, effortlessly united, was a direct contradiction to the picture she had painted of me all this time. Brian, clearly feeling the shift in power, tried to reassert himself. "So, Ashley," he said, slipping into his usual arrogant drawl. "What do you do?" I almost laughed. It was so predictable. That smug, corporate dominance play. He needed to place her, measure her worth. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. Ashley turned her attention to him, her smile never faltering. "I'm a news anchor for Channel 5, she said smoothly. "I do the morning and evening segments. You might have seen me." Heather's reaction was instant. Her eyes widened, just a fraction, before she caught herself. She knew exactly who Ashley was. Everyone in town did. She was a household name. Charismatic. Respected. Loved. Brian, however, wasn't as quick on the uptake. "Channel 5. He scoffed, trying to brush it off. "So, what? You read a teleprompter for a living?" Ashley tilted her head slightly, her smile sharpening just a bit. "I interview high-profile figures, cover breaking news, and moderate political debates. But yeah, sometimes I read a teleprompter too." Brian blinked. He hadn't expected that. Heather's shoulders went rigid. She knew she was losing control of this moment. I could see the wheels turning, the desperation bubbling just beneath the surface. And then, right on cue, she played her favorite card. "Well, I hope you're good with kids," she said sweetly, tilting her head toward Emma. "Because Jake isn't exactly the most hands-on parent. You know how firefighters are, always running into danger, barely home." She sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "It's why our marriage fell apart." A bold-faced lie. Ashley turned to Emma. "Sweetheart, how often does your daddy make you pancakes?" Emma beamed. "Every Sunday. And on Saturdays, he takes me to the park." Ashley looked back at Heather, her expression unreadable. "Sounds pretty hands-on to me." Heather's jaw clenched. Brian shifted uncomfortably. The power dynamic had shifted, and they both knew it. But I wasn't done yet. I glanced down at Emma and smiled. "Ready to head in, kiddo?" She nodded eagerly. Ashley bent down and gave her a quick hug. "I'll see you after school, okay? We'll go get ice cream." Heather's face paled. Because that was when she realized Ashley wasn't just here for me. She was here for Emma too. She was part of my daughter's life now. And there wasn't a damn thing Heather could do about it. Heather's expression twisted for the briefest second before she smoothed it over, but I saw it. That flash of something raw, something ugly, just beneath the surface. She had spent years constructing this illusion, this perfect narrative where I was nothing more than a passing shadow in my daughter's life, while she, the ever-devoted mother, held all the real influence. And now, right in front of her, that illusion was shattering. Emma wrapped her arms around my waist in a quick hug before running toward the school entrance, her little backpack bouncing with each step. Ashley and I stood side by side, watching her go, and I could feel the weight of Heather's stare drilling into us. She wasn't done, not even close. "Well," she said, exhaling sharply, "I suppose this is a big change for Emma. I mean, adjusting to a new woman in her life. You know how fragile kids are." Her voice was honeyed poison, sweet enough to sound concerned, sharp enough to be a weapon. Brian, who had been uncharacteristically silent, seemed to sense the shift and decided it was his turn to throw a punch. "Yeah, transitions can be tricky for young kids," he chimed in, nodding in that obnoxiously self-important way he always did. "I just hope this doesn't disrupt the stability we've worked so hard to build for her." I almost laughed. The stability they built? The same stability where Heather played mind games and manipulated Emma into seeing me as some kind of afterthought? The same stability where she paraded Brian around like an upgrade, making sure Emma saw every staged moment of their happy family act? I clenched my jaw, but before I could speak, Ashley did. "You're absolutely right," she said, turning toward them with an easy, unreadable expression. "Transitions can be hard for kids. That's why it's so important that all the adults in her life set a good example." She smiled, warm but unwavering. Luckily, Jake's been nothing but consistent with her. She knows she can always count on her dad. Heather's nails dug into the fabric of her coat. She wasn't used to this. Someone standing up to her without raising their voice, without sinking to her level. It threw her off balance. Brian, on the other hand, recovered quickly. He let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head. "Well, I guess we'll see, won't we?" His gaze flicked between me and Ashley, his smirk creeping back. New relationships can be exciting at first, but parenting isn't just about the honeymoon phase. It's a long game. And let's be honest, second marriages don't always have the best track record. Ashley didn't blink. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she turned to me and smiled. "That's funny," she said, looping her arm through mine. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like Jake and I already won the long game." The words hit like a bullet. Heather sucked in a breath, her lips parting like she was about to fire back, but nothing came. Because what could she say? For the first time in years, she wasn't in control of the conversation. Brian's smirk faltered. I could see it, the way his fingers flexed slightly, the way his jaw tensed. He wasn't used to being the one losing ground. And then Ashley did something that sent Heather right over the edge. She turned to her with a look of pure, unshakable confidence and said, "It was nice seeing you both. Have a great day." And then, just like that, she turned her back on them. Turned her back, like they weren't even worth the energy of another second. Heather seethed. I could practically feel the rage radiating off her as we walked away, my hand resting on the small of Ashley's back. The tables had turned so hard and so fast that Heather and Brian didn't even know how to respond. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I already knew what I would see. Two people standing there, rattled and speechless, watching as the life they thought they had power over slipped right through their fingers. The moment we stepped away, I felt it, the weight of victory. It wasn't the kind you shouted about. It wasn't loud or arrogant. It was quiet, effortless, the kind that settled deep in your bones. For 2 years, Heather had controlled the narrative. She had painted me as the sad, pitiful ex, the disposable husband, the lesser parent. She wanted me to be stuck in that place, forever living in her shadow. But now? Now she was the one standing there, blindsided, speechless, powerless. Ashley's hand slid into mine as we reached my truck, her fingers warm against my skin. She was still smiling, completely at ease, as if she hadn't just single-handedly dismantled Heather's entire facade. I exhaled, shaking my head. That was. Ashley turned to me, amused. "Fun." I laughed. "You really don't back down, do you? Not when it comes to you." She squeezed my hand, her expression softening. "I know what she's done to you, Jake. What she's still trying to do. I wasn't about to let her rewrite history just because she's uncomfortable with the truth." I looked back toward the school entrance. Heather and Brian were still standing there, locked in a silent, tense conversation. Heather was gesturing sharply, her face tight with frustration, while Brian's mouth was pressed into a thin line. Good. Let them sit with it. Let them sit with the fact that I had moved on. That I had won, not through revenge, not through fighting, but simply by being happy. But as satisfying as it was to watch them struggle with that realization, I knew Heather wasn't done. She never lost gracefully. And sure enough, as I opened the truck door for Ashley, I heard heels clicking rapidly against the pavement. "Heather, I need to talk to you," she said sharply, her voice a little too high, a little too tight. Ashley raised an eyebrow but didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She had already won. I turned to face Heather, keeping my expression unreadable. "What is it?" She hesitated. just for a second. Then, like clockwork, she switched tactics. Her shoulders softened. She tilted her head, lowering her voice into something calculated. It's about Emma. And there it was. Her favorite weapon. I didn't react, didn't flinch. What about her? Heather sighed, shaking her head like she was carrying some unbearable burden. Jake, I know you think you're doing the right thing, but introducing someone new into her life this quickly? It's reckless. I stared at her. Unbelievable. She had paraded Brian around like a prize pony from the moment our divorce was finalized, making sure Emma saw every carefully curated moment of their perfect family. And now she wanted to lecture me about what's best for our daughter? Heather took my silence as an opening. I just don't want her to get hurt, she continued, voice dripping with insincere concern. You don't know how long this is going to last. And if it falls apart, Emma will be caught in the middle. Ashley exhaled a short, quiet laugh. Heather snapped her gaze toward her. Something funny? Ashley smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. Just that it's interesting to hear you talk about what's best for Emma when you've spent the last 2 years trying to convince her that her father doesn't matter. Heather's eyes flashed with something sharp, rage, maybe even panic. I stepped in before she could regroup. Ashley's part of my life now, I said evenly. Which means she's part of Emma's life too. That's not changing. And the only person who needs to adjust to that is you. Heather's lips parted slightly, like she had been slapped. She had expected weakness, a crack in my confidence. She got neither. I could see it in her eyes, the unraveling. For the first time since our divorce, she wasn't in control of me. And she knew it. Heather's face shifted, just for a second, just long enough for me to see the raw frustration in her eyes. But she caught herself, smoothing it over with that practiced mask of composure she wore so well. She had built her whole life around controlling the people in it. Me, Emma, even Brian. And now, here I was, standing in front of her, unshaken, unmoved. That's what got to her the most. She took a slow breath, adjusting the strap of her designer purse like she needed something to do with her hands. Look, Jake, she said, her voice softer now, measured, like she was trying to reel me back in. I know you think you're happy right now, but you've always been impulsive. You rush into things without thinking. There it was. The subtle, quiet way she always tried to make me doubt myself. The same way she had done for years in our marriage. Back then, I would have second-guessed my choices. Back then, I would have let that seed of doubt take root. But I wasn't that man anymore. Ashley, standing beside me, must have felt the shift in my posture, because she squeezed my hand lightly. No words, just a reminder that she was there, that I wasn't alone in this fight. I met Heather's gaze, my voice steady. The only impulsive decision I ever made was staying with you longer than I should have. The hit landed. Her lips pressed together, and for a split second, I saw the real her. The one underneath the perfectly curated image. Brian, who had been standing off to the side with his arms crossed, suddenly pushed himself off the SUV and stepped closer. His presence had been an afterthought until now, but I could see the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders squared. He didn't like the way this was going. You've made your point, he said, slipping back into that corporate lawyer voice of his. The one meant to sound reasonable while simultaneously dismissing everyone else. No need to get hostile. Hostile? I almost laughed. This was the guy who had smirked behind my back for 2 years, basking in the glow of my ex-wife's carefully orchestrated happily ever after. And now, standing here, watching that fantasy unravel before his eyes, he suddenly wanted to play the mediator? Ashley, to my absolute delight, didn't let it slide. She turned to him, arching a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh, Brian," she said, her voice silky smooth but ice-cold underneath. "I didn't realize you were the expert on hostility." Brian's nostrils flared. "Excuse me." Ashley tilted her head, amused. "I mean, given the way you and Heather have spent the last 2 years going out of your way to make Jake feel small, staging your little power plays at school drop-off, making sure he always knew he was being watched, judged." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You didn't think we noticed? Heather shifted uncomfortably. Brian's face darkened, his cool, detached facade cracking at the edges. He didn't like being called out, especially not by a woman who wasn't intimidated by him. I stood there, watching them squirm. For years, they had been the ones with the upper hand. They had dictated the terms. They had controlled the story. Not anymore. Heather cleared her throat, desperate to reclaim ground. Jake, I just want to make sure Emma is okay. Her voice trembled just slightly. Calculated vulnerability. I don't want her to feel caught in the middle. That's when I knew she was panicking. Because Heather never played the concerned mother card unless she felt like she was losing. I took a step forward, my voice calm. Emma isn't in the middle. I let the words settle, watching as Heather's eyes flickered with something uneasy. She has a father who loves her, who is there for her. And now, she has Ashley too. Someone who treats her with kindness, with respect. I exhaled. The only person forcing her into a battle is you. Heather stiffened. Brian opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. They had lost, and they knew it. Ashley looked at her watch, then at me. We should get going, she said, like none of this had even fazed her. We have that brunch reservation. Heather's gaze snapped to me, the realization finally sinking in. We weren't just winning. We were living, and they couldn't stand it. Heather's mouth opened like she had something to say, some last-ditch effort to claw back control. But nothing came. No clever remark, no snide insult, nothing that could undo what had just happened. She had lost, and she knew it. I saw it in the way her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. The same fingers that used to dig into my arm during arguments, the same ones that used to point accusingly at me as if I was always the problem. But she wasn't pointing now. She wasn't controlling the conversation. She was drowning in it. Brian, ever the arrogant lawyer, was still trying to play it cool, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw locked tight. He hadn't expected this. He had expected the usual dynamic, the one where Heather dictated reality and I quietly took it. But that version of me was dead. Ashley's hand slipped into mine again, casual, effortless. But I knew exactly why she did it. Not for me. For Heather. Because it was another reminder. A reminder that I wasn't alone. That I wasn't waiting for some imaginary reconciliation. That I had something real. Ashley was everything Heather had pretended to be: genuine, confident, completely unbothered by the need for control. And Heather couldn't stomach it. Brian must have sensed the shift, because he suddenly forced out a laugh. Loud. Unnatural. The kind of laugh you do when you're trying to mask frustration. Well, this was fun, he said, clapping his hands together once. But I think we all have places to be. Ashley smiled at him, her expression polite but completely dismissive. Yes, we do. Heather's nails dug into the leather of her purse. I could see the words crawling behind her teeth, desperate to escape. She didn't want to leave without a win. She couldn't. And then, just as I reached for my truck door, she spat out her last, desperate move. I just hope, she said loudly, forcing sweetness into her tone, that you're not using Ashley to fill a void, Jake. I stopped. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to react. I turned back slowly, meeting her gaze head-on. She tilted her head, feigning concern, but I saw the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. You know how you are, she continued. You fall hard and fast, and then reality sets in. Just be careful. She pressed her lips together in a mockery of sincerity. For Emma's sake. There it was. The final knife. Heather was losing the war, but she was still clawing for any piece of emotional damage she could inflict. She wanted me to question myself. She wanted Ashley to question me. But she had miscalculated. Because I wasn't that man anymore. Ashley let out a soft, amused hum beside me. Wow, she said, looking at Heather like she was something pitiful. You really can't stand the fact that he's happy, can you? Heather flushed. Ashley smiled wider. Not cruel, just honest. Here's the difference between you and me, Ashley said, voice steady, calm. I don't need to be the center of Jake's universe. I don't need to control him or manipulate him or keep him second-guessing himself just to feel secure. She exhaled lightly. You lost him, Heather. And the saddest part? It wasn't because of me. Heather's lips parted slightly, her face drained of color. I could have stood there and relished the moment, but I didn't need to. The damage was already done. Instead, I turned back to my truck, opened the door for Ashley, and let the silence suffocate them. Heather and Brian stood frozen, watching as we pulled away, their figures growing smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, I drove away from Heather without feeling the weight of her behind me. She had no power over me anymore, and she never would again. The drive away from that battlefield of a school parking lot felt different. For the first time in years, I wasn't leaving with clenched fists or that familiar, heavy bitterness Heather used to plant inside me like a parasite. I was free. Ashley sat in the passenger seat, her expression relaxed, but I could tell she was watching me, gauging my reaction. She had seen it before, the way Heather tried to manipulate me, tried to twist every interaction into another attempt at control. But today she had watched Heather lose. You okay? She finally asked, her voice even. I exhaled through my nose, a slow breath. Yeah. I glanced at her. That was a hell of a performance. Ashley smirked. Which part? The part where you completely dismantled Heather without raising your voice. She shrugged lightly, turning to look out the window. She makes it easy. I laughed, shaking my head. You really got under her skin. Ashley turned back to me, her gaze steady. I wasn't trying to. And that was the worst part for Heather. Ashley hadn't been fighting her. She hadn't been trying to prove anything, hadn't been clawing for dominance. She just existed in a way Heather never could. Confident, secure, untouchable. Heather's entire life revolved around controlling the people in it. The second she couldn't do that, she fell apart. And today, I had watched it happen in real time. I flexed my fingers against the steering wheel, the tension leaving my body piece by piece. For years, I had been the one falling apart. Heather had made sure of that. She had manipulated me, drained me, rewritten our history to fit her narrative. And now? Now she had nothing left to hold on to. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Ashley reached over, tracing her fingers lightly over my wrist, grounding me back in the moment. So, she said, her tone lighter now, teasing, are we actually going to this brunch, or was that just a power move? I chuckled, shaking my head. I made a reservation. Figured we'd celebrate. She grinned. Celebrate what? I glanced at her, feeling something in my chest unclench. Winning, I said simply. And for the first time in years, I really meant it. Brunch was at a quiet little spot downtown, the kind of place that didn't rush you, where the coffee was strong, and the food came out perfect every time. I'd made the reservation without thinking much about it, but now, as Ashley and I sat across from each other, coffee cups in hand, I realized something. This was the first time in years that I wasn't carrying Heather's shadow into my day. I wasn't analyzing our conversation, replaying her words in my head, wondering what game she was playing, what move she'd make next. I was just here. Ashley stretched a little, her fingers trailing along the rim of her cup. So, she said, her tone casual but curious, was that the worst she's ever been? I let out a breath, considering. Not even close. Ashley raised an eyebrow, smirking. Figures. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle. She's always been like that. Controlling. But after the divorce? I shook my head. She took it to another level. Ashley leaned in slightly. What was the worst? I exhaled through my nose, a humorless chuckle escaping. Probably when she tried to get full custody. Ashley stilled, her smirk fading. She actually tried? I nodded. She didn't want Emma because she cared. She wanted Emma because she knew it would destroy me. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. She pulled every dirty trick she could. Claimed I was too busy with my job, that I was emotionally unstable after the divorce. Even tried to use my schedule against me, saying firefighters don't have traditional hours and that Emma needed stability. Ashley's fingers curled around her cup, her eyes darkening. That's disgusting. Yeah, I muttered. And the worst part? She almost won. Ashley didn't speak right away. She just stared at me, her expression unreadable, like she was turning something over in her mind. Finally, she leaned back, exhaling slowly. What changed? I let a small smile tug at my lips. Emma. Ashley tilted her head. She told the judge she wanted to be with me, I said, my voice quieter now. She told them that even though I worked long hours, I was always there when it mattered, that I made her feel safe. I swallowed the lump that always formed when I thought about that day. She saved me. Ashley reached across the table, lacing her fingers through mine. Her grip was firm, steady. No, she said softly. You saved her. She just made sure the world saw it. I looked at her, really looked at her, and something settled inside me. For so long, I had felt like I was constantly fighting battles alone. Against Heather. Against the system. Against the version of myself she had tried to leave behind. But sitting here, across from this woman who saw me, really saw me, I realized something. I wasn't alone anymore. Heather could play all the games she wanted. She could claw and scramble and try to rewrite reality. But none of it mattered, because I wasn't playing anymore. And that? That was a battle she would never win. The rest of brunch passed in easy conversation, the kind that wasn't forced, the kind I had forgotten was possible after years of walking on eggshells with Heather. Ashley wasn't just a partner, she was someone who made me feel like I could breathe again. But even as we finished up, even as we walked out of the restaurant hand in hand, I knew it wasn't over. Heather wouldn't take this loss quietly. She never did. By the time we got back to my place, I had a missed call. 2, actually. Heather. Ashley saw the name flash across my screen as I set my phone on the kitchen counter. She arched an eyebrow. That didn't take long. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. No, it didn't. Ashley folded her arms, leaning against the counter. You gonna call her back? I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. I already knew what this was. Damage control. Heather wasn't used to losing, and she definitely wasn't used to losing in front of an audience. She had probably spent the last hour stewing, running through every possible angle, trying to figure out how to flip this. But there was nothing left to flip. Still, I had a daughter to think about. I exhaled sharply and grabbed my phone, hitting call. It rang twice before she answered. Jake. Her voice was different. Not angry. Not condescending. Measured. Controlled. I knew that voice. It was the one she used when she wanted something. What do you want, Heather? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated. Just for a second. Then she let out a soft, practiced sigh. I just think we should talk. I clenched my jaw. Of course she did. Talk about what? Another pause. Then, about Emma. I closed my eyes briefly, forcing myself to stay calm. Emma is fine. Heather made it sound like she was holding back a scoff. Jake, come on. You dropped a huge change into her life today. Don't you think we should be making these kinds of decisions together? I opened my eyes, my grip tightening on the phone. Like how you made the decision to move Brian in after 6 months? Silence. Gotcha. Heather cleared her throat. That was different. I laughed. Actually laughed. How exactly? She didn't have an answer. Instead, she switched tactics. Look, I just think it would be better if we sat down, just the two of us, and talked about how we're going to co-parent moving forward. I could hear it now, the desperation creeping in. She was scrambling, grasping at anything she could. Because this wasn't about Emma. It was about control. It was about Heather realizing, for the first time, that she didn't have it anymore. I leaned against the counter, glancing over at Ashley, who was watching me carefully. We already have a custody agreement, Heather. Nothing about that is changing. A beat of silence. Then, her real voice came out. Cold. Cutting. Well, it's nice to see you're just as stubborn as ever. There she was. The real Heather. I almost smiled. You have a good day, Heather. And then I hung up. I set the phone down, feeling lighter. Ashley tilted her head, watching me. That went well. I smirked. Oh yeah. She's furious. Ashley grinned, stepping closer, looping her arms around my neck. Good. I wrapped my arms around her waist, holding her close. For the first time in years, I wasn't just existing. I was winning. And Heather? She was finally realizing that. The rest of the day felt different, not just because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't. I didn't feel the usual weight after dealing with Heather. I wasn't stuck replaying the conversation in my head, trying to dissect the hidden daggers in her words. I wasn't bracing for whatever game she'd play next. For the first time since the divorce, I wasn't trapped in her cycle. I was out. Really out. Ashley must have noticed, because as we sat on the couch later that night, legs tangled together, she ran her fingers along my arm absent-mindedly. "You look lighter." I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. "Because I am." She smirked. Heather must be losing her mind. "Oh, definitely." I laughed, shaking my head. She didn't expect me to be this happy. Ashley studied me for a second, her expression softening. "Are you?" I turned to her, my fingers tracing along the inside of her wrist. "Yeah," I said, meaning every word. "I really am." Ashley grinned, but before she could say anything else, my phone vibrated on the table. I glanced at the screen. "Heather." Again. Ashley sighed dramatically. "She's really committed to this meltdown, huh?" I smirked, but something told me this wasn't just another round of manipulation. Heather never overplayed her hand like this. If she was calling again, there was a reason. I grabbed my phone and answered. "Heather, what now?" She didn't snap at me. She didn't throw some bitter, passive-aggressive remark. She just exhaled shakily. And that's when I realized something was wrong. "Jake," she said, her voice lower, almost uncertain. "We have a problem." I sat up straighter, my grip on the phone tightening. "What are you talking about?" Heather hesitated. Then, in a voice that was nothing like the woman I had been battling all day, she whispered, "Brian's been lying to me." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. Ashley's eyebrows pulled together as she watched my face change. "Jake." I didn't answer her. I was too focused on Heather's voice, on the edge of something real in it. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. Heather exhaled again, a humorless, broken laugh escaping. "I mean, I think I just made the biggest mistake of my life." I had no idea what she was about to tell me, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. Heather's voice didn't sound like Heather. It wasn't condescending. It wasn't manipulative. It wasn't coated in that usual veneer of control. It was shaken, raw, and that sent a chill down my spine. Ashley sat up beside me, watching closely, waiting for me to react. But I couldn't. Not yet. Because Heather never admitted to being wrong. Not once. Not ever. "What are you talking about?" I asked carefully. Heather let out a slow, shaky exhale. "Brian isn't who I thought he was." I almost laughed. Almost. No kidding. She didn't snap back. She didn't even get defensive. She just went quiet. And that's when I realized it was bad. Really bad. I leaned forward, my tone sharp now. "Heather, what happened?" Silence. Then, her voice, barely above a whisper. "I think he's been cheating on me." I blinked. Once. Twice. Let the words sink in. And then, I laughed. A short, sharp burst of disbelief. Not because it was funny. Not because I was happy about it. But because the irony was so thick, I could choke on it. Heather. The master manipulator. The queen of control. The woman who prided herself on always being 10 steps ahead. Had been played. She must have heard the amusement in my voice because suddenly, the Heather I knew was back. "Oh, you think this is funny?" she snapped, the tremble in her voice now edged with anger. I pinched the bridge of my nose. "I don't think it's funny, Heather. I think it's karma." Silence. Not because she disagreed, but because she knew I was right. For years, she had humiliated me. She had torn apart our marriage, convinced herself that Brian was an upgrade, that she had somehow won by leaving me behind. And now? Now she was calling me because the man she left me for had done to her what she did to me. "You don't get to act like the victim now," I said, my voice cold, steady. "Not after everything." Heather inhaled sharply, but she didn't argue. Because what could she say? She had painted me as the weak one, the one she had left behind, the one who would never move on. But now, I was the one happily married to a woman who loved me. And Heather? She was standing in the wreckage of the life she destroyed with her own hands. I let the silence stretch, let her sit with the weight of it. Then, finally, I spoke. "Good luck, Heather." And I hung up. My phone buzzed again almost instantly, but I didn't even glance at it. I just set it down, feeling lighter than I had in years. Ashley leaned against me, her voice amused. That sounded dramatic. I let out a breath, shaking my head. It was. She tilted her head, studying me. "You okay?" I smiled. Really smiled. "Yeah," I said, wrapping an arm around her. "I really am." And for the first time since Heather blew up my life, I meant it. Because I had finally won. And Heather? Heather was just beginning to realize she had lost everything.